Ever feel like you're just scratching the surface, wanting to really get to grips with complex ideas quickly?
Yeah, wanting to understand what really shaped a particular field or thinker.
Exactly. That's what we aim for here. We take key sources, dive deep, and try to pull out the core insights for you. Kind of a shortcut to being properly informed.
And today we're diving into the world of Islamic mysticism. We're
Mhm.
focusing on the formative years of Ibn Arabi, an incredibly influential figure.
Right, whose ideas still echo today. And we're using excerpts from Quest for the Red Sulphur, mainly.
That's the plan, to piece together those early experiences, the relationships, basically what set him on his path.
Okay, so let's kick off with Ibn Arabi in Andalusia. The first thing that jumps out is the context is that sounds like a pretty turbulent time politically and geographically.
Oh, absolutely. You're talking 12th century Andalusia. It was in constant flux. The Reconquista, the Christian reconquest, was well underway.
Toledo had already fallen, right? That must have
Mhm,
been a
yeah.
huge shock.
A massive psychological blow, yes. That was 1085. Saragossa followed later. So there's this background pressure, this sense of shifting ground in Muslim Spain. Think about how that environment might affect a young person growing up.
Definitely. And it wasn't just external pressure, was it? The internal power struggles within Muslim Andalusia itself.
Precisely. You had the Almoravids, who had been dominant, but then they were replaced by another Berber dynasty, the Almohads.
And they made Seville their capital.
They did. Now, Ibn Arabi was born in Murcia, which actually resisted the Almohads for a while, so his very early childhood might have seen, relative prosperity followed by war and uncertainty.
That contrast, stability then disruption, could that maybe push someone towards seeking something more permanent, something deeper?
It's a compelling thought, isn't it? A search for truths beyond the shifting political sands.
So, honing in on his immediate circle, what about his family?
Well, the sources mention his father served the Almohad rulers, possibly even as a vizier, a senior official, though there's some uncertainty about the exact role. We also know he had a mother and two sisters, Saz and Ala. Interestingly, no mention of brothers. So it's a family with political connections.
But also spiritual ones. You mentioned uncles.
Yes, exactly. That seems quite significant. Three uncles are noted for their spiritual interests or aspirations.
On both sides of the family.
It seems so. His father's brother, Abu Muhammad Abdullah al-Sab al-Tai, apparently made a very strong impression. And then two on his mother's side, Abu Muslim al-Khalan and Yahya Biyukan.
So this wasn't something he just stumbled into later. The seeds were there in the family environment.
Absolutely. It suggests spirituality was valued, discussed, maybe even practiced within the wider family. It wasn't coming out of the blue.
And there was also that story about a really intense personal experience early on, a serious illness when he was about 12.
Yes, that's right. It might have been during a plague epidemic around 571 or 572 AH, so the early 1170s. He describes having a vision during this illness.
The vision of who?
Possibly a figure named Abu M. Makhluf al-Kabaili. These kinds of intense, maybe near-death experiences, they can often be real turning points, can't they?
Definitely. Pushing you to ask bigger questions, you have to wonder what that did to him at such a young age.
Hmm.
Okay, so fast forward a few years, he's around 18, and he makes a conscious commitment to the spiritual path. Where does this really start to take shape?
It seems Seville is the key location for this formal beginning, around 578 AH or 1182 CE.
And he starts with serious study.
Yes, studying the Quran in depth with a teacher named Abu Bakr Muhammad B. Khalaf al-Lakmi. He learned the 7 canonical readings, which is quite a scholarly feat.
Mastering all the different ways to recite the Quran.
Exactly. And he studied a specific text, the Kitab al-Kafi. So
Yeah.
a really strong grounding in the scripture right from the start. That's crucial for understanding his later work.
But then comes the meeting with his first murshid, his spiritual guide. That feels like the real launchpad. Abul Abbas al-Lulyabi.
Yes. That encounter around 1184 seems pivotal. The story goes that Ibn Arabi sought his counsel even before al-Lulyabi properly looked at him. Shows his eagerness.
And the advice he got was pretty intense.
Extremely direct.
Yeah.
Close your door, break all ties, and keep company with the all-bounteous.
Wow. That's not easing into it.
Not at all. It's about radical detachment, focusing solely on the divine, a core Sufi idea, but given so starkly right at the beginning, it must have set a powerful tone.
And he apparently just did it, jumped straight into retreat.
He seems to have, yes. He writes about practicing it until he felt its effects. What's interesting, though,
But
is that later in life, he actually advised beginners to start with Riyada ascetic practices,
Yeah.
spiritual exercises, before going into that kind of intense retreat.
So a difference between his own start and what he later recommended.
It suggests his own entry might have been somewhat exceptional, perhaps divinely guided in a unique way.
Fascinating. It really shows how personal journeys can be. Now, thinking broader than just his direct teachers, Andalusia had this whole existing Sufi scene, didn't it? Did earlier figures influence him?
Oh, definitely. He wasn't operating in a vacuum.
Hmm.
Andalusia had a rich Sufi history, and he clearly drew on it. Ibn al-Arif is a major figure here.
Ibn al-Arif. How did Ibn Arabi view him?
With immense respect. He mentions Ibn al-Arif's book, Mahasin al-Majalis, frequently. He even calls him Sheikhuna, our master, and praises his perfect knowledge. That shows a real sense of connection to that lineage.
So Ibn al-Arif was a clear touchstone. What about others from that earlier Almoravid period, like Ibn Barajan or Ibn Qasi?
He mentions Ibn Barajan's Kitab al-Hikmah.
Yeah.
His relationship with Ibn Qasi is, well, it's more complicated. It actually changed over time.
Oh, how so?
Initially, when he was in Tunis, he came across Ibn Qazi's work, the Qawl al-Alain, and seemed to respect it.
Okay.
But much later, when Ibn Arabi was in Damascus, he wrote a commentary on that same book, and his opinion had completely shifted, dramatically so.
A total turnaround. What happened? Why the change?
It seems that as he engaged more deeply with the text for his commentary, he became really critical of Ibn Qazi's ideas.
Critical in what way?
He accused him of theological errors, even questioned if his spiritual experiences were genuine, called him an imitator, an ignoramus. Strong words.
Wow. So he wasn't afraid to critique predecessors if he felt they deviated from the path.
Not at all. It really highlights his commitment to what he saw as authentic spiritual truth, even if it meant revising earlier opinions.
Interesting to see that critical edge. Okay, so moving beyond Andalusia itself, his travels in the Maghreb Seville again, Fez, Tunis, seem really crucial.
Absolutely critical. The year 586 AH back in Seville seems particularly charged. He had this intense longing to meet the great Sufi master Abu Madian.
Did they ever meet?
Physically, no. But something quite extraordinary happened. Abu Madian's companion, a man named Abu Imran Musa al-Sudrani, arrived unexpectedly.
With a message.
Yes, a message confirming a deep spiritual link between Ibn Arabi and Abu Madian, even though they wouldn't meet in this life. Imagine the validation that must have been for him.
Incredible, like a spiritual confirmation. And didn't he also have some significant experiences in Seville that same year? In a cemetery, of all places?
That's right. He describes receiving divine inspiration there, experiencing the descent of the Quran in a shower of stars. A very direct, powerful kind of revelation.
These personal, mystical experiences seem absolutely central to his development.
Undeniably. They formed the bedrock of his understanding and his spiritual authority.
Then he travels to Fez. Why Fez? What drew him there?
He spent a fair bit of time there on and off between about 1189 and 1197. Probably a mix of reasons, personal and spiritual. Fez was a major hub for Moroccan Sufism.
Abu Madian's influence again.
Exactly. Many of Abu Madian's disciples were there. It offered a chance for deeper immersion, maybe also some distance from his Andalusian roots.
And he met scholars there too.
Yes, he met a muhaddith, a transmitter of prophetic traditions, named Muhammad bi Qasim al-Tamimi al-Fasi.
What did he learn from him?
Al-Fasi shared traditions about local saints in Fez, especially one called Abu Abd Allah al-Dakwak, drawing from his own book. So Ibn Arabi was broadening his knowledge of different Sufi circles and traditions.
And Tunis was another significant stop, particularly his connection with Sheikh Abda Aziz al-Madawi.
Yes, Tunis was very important. Al-Madawi seems to have been a bit reserved toward him initially, but Ibn Arabi held him in incredibly high regard.
How high?
Well, he dedicated two of his major works to him, Ruh al-Quds and the massive Futuhat Makkiyah. He calls him Al-Wali, the friend of God. That's significant praise.
Dedicating the Futuhat. That's huge.
It is. He also wrote a treatise for al-Madawi's followers and apparently planned a whole book just on his virtues.
There's also that mention of being four corner supports.
Right. During a later stay in Tunis, he describes himself, al-Madawi, and two others as forming the four arkan, or supports. It shows a sense of profound spiritual kinship and importance he felt with Madawi.
And there's that anecdote about the hammam, the baths.
Ah, yes, recounted by his father. It involves al-Madawi and another sheikh. It gives a little personal glimpse and also, quite poignantly, helps date his father's death to shortly after Ibn Arabi first returned from Tunis.
These travels, encounters, they seem to go hand in hand with deep inner shifts. like giving away his possessions when he was around 20.
That's a striking story. He later clarified it was specifically for those without family dependents. Pushing back against theories, it meant he was married early.
And he said he hadn't met formal teachers yet at that point.
Exactly, which suggests it was a spontaneous act of renunciation, driven by his own inner state, even before formal discipleship.
Then comes that major vision in 590 AH, seeing himself as the heir of Abraham's community. That sounds like a massive realization.
Huge. A profound insight into his own spiritual station and purpose, understanding himself in terms of spiritual fatherhood and sonship linked to Abraham.
And the advice he got around that time: beware of tasting vinegar after tasting honey.
From Saleh al-Barbari. Yes, perhaps a warning to stay true to the sweetness of divine knowledge he was receiving, not to turn back to lesser things.
Before he heads east towards Mecca, there's a mention of stopping in Bougie.
Yes, briefly. After leaving Andalusia before Tunis, it just adds to this picture of constant movement, searching, learning during this period.
Right, a period of intense preparation almost.
You could definitely see it that way, widening his experience before the next major phase.
Which brings us to Mecca, arriving around 598 AH or 1201 CE. This seems like another massive turning point. New people, new inspirations.
Mecca was hugely significant. He met important scholars like Abu Shujaq Zahir b Rostam al-Isfahanil. He received a major hadith collection from him.
Al-Tamidi's collection.
That's the one. And he met Abu Shujaq's learned sister, Fakhr al-Nisa, who gave him a general license, an ijaza amma, to teach.
And of course, Nizam.
Ah, Nizam, the daughter of a local religious figure. Her beauty and spiritual presence inspired his famous poetry collection, the Tarjuman al-Ashwaq, the Interpreter of Desires.
That collection, it's often interpreted romantically, but Ibn Arabi himself explained it differently, didn't he?
Crucially, yes. He insisted that while Nizam was the initial inspiration, the poems ultimately referred to divine realities, spiritual insights, using the language of love and beauty as metaphors for the divine. It's key to understanding his symbolic language.
Good point. He also received the Sufi cloak, the kirka, again in Mecca.
Yes, his third investiture in 1203. This one linked him to the lineage of the famous Abd al-Qadir al-Jilani, transmitted through Yunus b. Yahya al-Hashimi, who was also one of his hadith teachers, another layer strengthening his Sufi connections.
And his scholarly work continued there too, selecting sacred hadith.
Right. He compiled 40 hadith Qudsiya divine sayings, revealed through the Prophet, which became the first part of his Mishkat al-Anwar. He drew on several transmitters he met there,
including some figures we've already mentioned.
Yes, people like Yunus al-Hashimi, Habashi, Muhammad b. Qasim al-Tamimi. He also composed another work, Ornament the Abdal, while in nearby Taif, outlining virtues of certain saints, requested by some companions.
The sources also paint a vivid picture of Mecca around that time, celestial events, natural disasters.
Yeah, it mentions numerous comets appearing around 1199-1200, and also a severe dust storm and plague hitting Yemen and Taif concurrently. It's a reminder of the sometimes dramatic backdrop to his life and travels.
Definitely puts things in perspective. So after Mecca and the Hijaz, he travels more, including Asia Minor where he met King Kaikas, but eventually settles in Syria.
Yes, Damascus and Aleppo became his base in later life.
Why Syria?
He apparently felt a deep spiritual connection to the land, believing it held a special sacred status based on a prophetic tradition. He explicitly contrasted this feeling with Cairo, where he didn't seem to feel the same connection.
Interesting. So looking back over this whole early period, what would you say are the absolute key formative threads that made Ibn Arabi who he became?
Well, you've got the Andalusian context, that mix of high culture and political instability. Then there's the family background, those spiritual inclinations from his uncles.
Crucial teachers, too.
Absolutely. Key guides like Al-Luyabi, and the indirect but powerful influence of figures like Abu Madian. And then you can't overlook his own profound, direct spiritual experiences. The illness vision, the cemetery revelations, the Abrahamic inheritance vision.
And the travels themselves, meeting people in Fez, Tunis, Mecca.
Exactly. Those encounters broadened his horizons enormously, connecting him to different strands of Sufism and scholarship. It all feeds in.
It really feels like these weren't just early steps, but the actual laying of the foundation for everything that followed. His complex thought didn't just appear, it grew out of all this.
Precisely. These formative years were the crucible where the unique figure of Ibn Arabi was forged.
Which leaves us with a final thought, maybe for you listening. How do all these different elements, the politics, the family, the visions, the teachers, the travels, how do they actually weave together to form this incredibly complex, influential figure? And maybe what can we learn from his journey, the way his path unfolded, for our own understanding today? Something to ponder, perhaps.